Caesar's second invasion of Britain in 54 BCE. It was a year after the first invasion. He was generally more thoroughly prepared, and this included sailing in July, which was 1 month earlier than the previous invasion in 55 BCE. In Book 5, blocks 1 to 25, he was generally more successful, despite generally fierce and more organized resistance from the Gauls, from the Britons, sorry. Britain eventually surrendered, but Caesar had to return to Gaul to quash Gallic rebellions, and Rome wouldn't invade again for 100 years. In blocks 26 to 37 of Book 5, it focuses upon this revolt in Gaul. So this time, rather than having one large camp, and also due to a poor harvest, Caesar distributed his legions among various tribal territories. But somebody called Ambiorix attacks Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Cotta's camp, but fails. So feeling indebted, Ambiorix offered the Romans safe passage from their camp to Quintus Tullius Cicero's, so Marcus Tullius, the more famous Marcus Tullius's brother, or Labienus's camp, so just other Roman generals, which Sabinus and Cotta come to accept, but instead their forces are ambushed and routed. So bring us to block 35, so block 38 in Book 5. So just a reading of the Latin just as an oral companion for you. Ambiorix rouses the Aduatuci and the Nervii and falls on Cicero's camp with huge forces, so just other Gallic tribes. Lifted by this victory, Ambiorix set out with his cavalry at once into the Aduatuci, who were neighbors with his kingdom. He ceases neither night nor day and orders his infantry to follow him closely. With the matter explained and the Aduatuci roused, the next day he arrived among the Nervii, and he urges that they not forsake the opportunity of freeing their own people forever and avenging the Romans for those injustices which they've received from them. He explains that 2 lieutenants have been killed and that a large part of the army has died, and that it was no trouble that the legion, which may pass the winter with Cicero, surprised suddenly, be killed. He declares himself a helper for that circumstance. He easily persuades the Nervii with this speech. Block 39. Therefore, with messengers sent away immediately towards Citrones, Grudi, Lovaki, Plumoxi, and Gaidumni, who are all under that is the Nervii's command, they gather together as large bands of men as they can and rush unexpectedly towards Cicero's winter quarters with a report about Titurius's death not yet brought towards him. It also happened to this man, which was necessary, that some soldiers who'd left into the woods to fetch wood and build fortifications were intercepted by the enemy horsemen's sudden arrival. With these men surrounded by a large band of men, the Eburones, the Nervii, the Aduatuci, and all these people's allies and followers begin to attack at the legion. Our men quickly run towards arms together and they climb the rampart. That day is endured with difficulty because the enemy put all their hope in their speed, and having attained this victory, they were sure that they would be victorious forever. So I'll just give you a moment just to, that's the accompanying Latin. Block 40. Cicero fails to get messages to Caesar, but gallantly holds out against the Gauls' attacks. Letters are sent immediately towards Caesar by Cicero, with great rewards proposed for the messengers if they'd brought them to him. With all the roads blockaded, the people sent are intercepted. At night, from the timber which they'd collected with the purpose of fortification, 120 towers are raised or built with quite incredible speed. Things which were seen to be missing from the work are completed. The next day, the enemy, with far or much larger forces gathered together, attack the camp and they fill the ditch. It is resisted by our men the same way in which they did so the day before. This same thing happens successively in or on the remaining days. With regards to their work, no part of the night time is allowed to elapse. An opportunity for rest is given to neither the sick nor the wounded. Whatever things they need for the next day's attack are procured at night. Many stakes harden at the point, and a large number of mural javelins are set up. Towers are built in stories, and battlements and parapets are added on with faggots. Cicero himself, when he was in very poor health, didn't even leave for himself the night time for rest, so that he might be compelled to spare himself from the soldiers' spontaneous assault and voices. Block 41. Then the Nervii leaders and the chiefs, who had some avenue of discourse on pretext of friendship with Cicero, so that they wished to talk to him, with permission given, they recall the same things which Ambiorix had discussed with Titurius, that all Gaul was in arms, that the Germans have crossed the Rhine, and that Caesar's and the remaining soldiers' winter quarters were being attacked. They also add about Sabinus's death. They make Ambiorix known with the purpose of convincing him. The Nervii, so the Romans are wrong if they hope for any protection by these people who distrust their own affairs. That they themselves, however, are of this opinion towards Cicero and the Roman people, so that they refuse nothing except winter quarters and refuse that this custom become established. That through them, these Nervii, it was all right for them, the Romans, to depart safely from the winter quarters and to set out without fear into whatever parts they may wish. Cicero said only one thing in reply towards these things, that the Roman people's custom wasn't to accept terms from an armed enemy. If they are willing to part with their arms, they may use him as their advocate, and they may send envoys towards Caesar. And that he hoped by virtue of his, that is Caesar's justice, that they would obtain the things which they have sought. Block 42. Disappointed from this hope, the Nervii surrounded the winter quarters with a rampart of 9 feet and a ditch of 15 feet. They'd both got to know these things from us from the previous year's social intercourse, and they were taught by those whom they secretly had as prisoners from our army. But with no supply of tools which were suitable for this use, they struggled to cut the turf with their swords and remove the earth with their hands and cloaks. In fact, from this circumstance, a great number of our men could be identified, for within 3 hours, they finished a fortification of 15,000 feet in circumference, and in the remaining days, they began to prepare and make towers towards the rampart's height, siege hooks and shelters, which the same prisoners had taught them. Block 43. On the attack's 7th day, with a very great wind having risen, they began to throw from slings hot bullets made from hardened clay and heated javelins onto the houses, which by Gallic custom were dwellings of straw. These houses quickly caught fire and by the wind's strength dispersed into every place in the camp. With a very loud shout, as if victory were already procured, the enemy both began to push their towers and shelters forward and to climb the rampart with ladders. But so great was our soldiers' courage and that presence of mind that when they were scorched by flame from all sides and they were pressed upon by a great number of missiles and realized that all their own baggage and possessions were burning, not only did no one withdraw from the rampart with the purpose of retreating, but not nearly even anyone looked back, and then all fought very fiercely and very bravely. This day was by far the most painful for our men, but however, it had this result that on that day, the largest number of the enemy was wounded and was killed as they crowded themselves together under the rampart itself, and the farthest didn't give a retreat to the foremost. In fact, with the flame having abated a little and with a tower driven from a certain place and touching the rampart, give me a sec, the third cohort centurions withdrew from that place in which they were standing, withdrew all their men, and they began to call the enemy with a nod and their voices if they wished to enter, none of whom dared to advance. Then with stones hurled from every direction and with the men pulled down, their tower was set fire to. Block 44. The courage of centurions Pullo and Vorenus. Very brave men were in that legion, including centurions Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus, who were approaching the first lines. These men used to have continuous disputes between them, which should be preferred, and they used to compete for promotions with the utmost animosity every year. When battle was being fought very fiercely near the fortifications, one of them, Pullo, says, "Why do you hesitate, Vorenus? Or which rank are you awaiting to approve your courage? This day will decide our disputes." When he had said these things, he proceeds outside the fortifications and rushes into the place in which part of the enemy seemed in closest order. Then not even Vorenus confines himself to the rampart, but having feared everyone's opinion, follows closely. With a sizable space left, Pullo sent his javelin into the enemy and he pierces one of the multitude rushing forward. With this man struck and killed, they, the enemy, cover this man over with all their shields, all hurl their javelins into the enemy, and they don't give it, that is the enemy, an opportunity to go back. Pullo's shield is pierced and a javelin is fixed firmly in his belt. This misfortune turns his sheath aside and it retards the right hand of the man trying to draw out his sword, and the enemy surround the embarrassed or encircled man. His enemy, Vorenus, personal individual enemy, that is, from way back, helps him and comes to the assistance of him whilst in distress. All the crowd immediately turned from Pullo towards this man, that is Vorenus. They think that he's been killed by the javelin. Vorenus, with his sword near at hand, fights, and with one man killed, he drives away the remaining enemy soldiers a little. While he presses on more eagerly, thrown down into a hollow, he fell. Pullo brings assistance to this man, that is Vorenus, surrounded again, and both with a great number killed by them, retreat safely inside the fortifications with the highest praise. Thus, fortune favored each in the dispute and rivalry, so that one enemy was of help and a safeguard to the other, and it couldn't be decided which of the two, by his courage, seemed to be preferred to which. Block 45. Cicero gets a message through to Caesar, who marches to relieve him. As much as the attack was heavier and more violent day by day, and especially because with a large part of the soldiers exhausted by their wounds, the matter had come down to a small number of defenders. More frequent letters and messages were sent towards Caesar so far, a part of whom, having been caught, was killed by torture in view of our soldiers. Inside our camp was one Nervian called Vertico, born from a respectable rank, who deserted towards Cicero from the earliest siege and had proven his own loyalty to him. This man persuades his slave with the hope of freedom and great rewards to bring a letter to Caesar. He, the slave, carries this out, fastened on his javelin, and having been a Gaul among the Gauls without any suspicion, he reaches Caesar. From him, it's known about the dangers of Cicero and of the legion. Block 46. With the letter received at around the 11th hour of the day, Caesar at once sends a messenger into the Bellovaci, a Belgian tribe of Northeast Gaul, towards Marcus Crassus, their quaestor, whose winter quarters were 25 miles away from him. He orders the legion to set out in the middle of the night and quickly come to him. Crassus goes out with the messenger. He sends another messenger towards Gaius Fabius, the lieutenant, to lead his legion into the Atrebates territory, in which, that is in the legion, he knew that a march was to be made by him. He writes to Labienus to come with his legion towards the Nervii borders if he could do this for the advantage of the state. He doesn't think that the remaining part of the army, because it was a little further away, was to be waited for, but he gathers around 400 horsemen from the nearest winter quarters. Block 47. Caesar meets Fabius en route to Cicero with Crassus to join them. Labienus can't attack the Nervii because his camp was under threat from the Treviri. Having been informed about Crassus's arrival by scouts at around the 3rd hour that day, he proceeds 20 miles. He puts Crassus in charge of Samarobriva, a Gallic place, Roman headquarters garrison, and he assigns him a legion because there he was leaving behind the army's baggage, the state's hostages, public documents, and all the corn which he'd carried down there with the purpose of enduring the winter. As it had been ordered to him, Fabius, having not delayed so much, meets him on the march with his legion. With Sabinus's death and the cohorts massacre known, when all the Treviri's forces had come against him, having feared if he'd made a flight-like departure from his winter quarters that he mightn't be able to withstand the enemy's attack, especially knowing them to be exalted in their recent victory, Labienus sends a letter back to Caesar saying how much danger he'd lead his legion out from the winter quarters. He describes the business conducted among their barones. He informs him that all the Treviri's cavalry and infantry forces have taken up a position far off, 3 miles from his own camp. Block 48. With his, Labienus's plan approved, Cicero received Caesar's letter and ensures his, that is, Caesar's orders are promptly carried out. With Labienus's plan approved, Caesar, although disappointed by 3 legions' reputation, he'd returned to only 2, nevertheless based that the only assistance for their common safety was in speed. He came into the Nervi's territory with long marches. There he learns from prisoners the things which are being conducted in Cicero's presence and in how great danger the campaign was. Then he persuades with great rewards a man of the horsemen from the Gauls to bring a letter to Cicero. He sends this letter written in Greek letters so that with our letter intercepted, our plans may not be known by the enemy. If he can't enter, he advises him to throw his javelin with the letter tied to the javelin strap inside the camp's fortification. He writes in the letter that he, having set out with his legions, will quickly be there. He urges him to retain his former courage. The Gaul, having feared danger, throws his javelin as was his order. This stuck to a tower by chance and not observed by our men for 2 days. It's seen by a soldier on the 3rd day, and taken away, it's carried to Cicero. Cicero recites the letter, having been read through, in a meeting of the soldiers and endows all with very great joy. Then the fire's smoke was seen far off, a circumstance which removed all doubt of the legion's arrival. Block 49. With the matter known through their scouts, the Gauls abandoned the siege and marched to Caesar with all their forces. These were around 60,000 armed men. With an opportunity given, Cicero again demands a Gaul from the same Vertico, whom we pointed out above, to carry a letter to Caesar. He warns this man, that is Caesar, to make his journey cautiously and carefully. He writes in his letter that the enemies left him and turned the whole force against him. With this letter brought towards him in around the middle of the night, Caesar informs his own men and encourages them to fight. The next day at dawn, he moves his camp, and having advanced around 4 miles, he sees the enemy's forces across the valley and stream. It was an affair of great danger to fight with so little forces in an unfavorable place. Then, since he knew that Cicero had been freed from the siege, he patiently thought that he must relax from his speed. He took up a position and builds a camp in the most favorable place he possibly can. And although these things were small by themselves, with scarcely 7,000 of his men, especially with no baggage, with the road's narrowness, however, he contracts as much as he possibly can with that plan so that he may come into the greatest disregard to the enemy. Meanwhile, with scouts sent out in all directions, he investigates by which way he can most suitably cross the valley. Block 50. That day, with very small battles having happened to cavalrymen near the water, each army contained itself in their own place, because the Gauls were awaiting larger forces which hadn't yet assembled. If Caesar could by chance, by pretense of fear, lure the enemy out into his position so that he might fight them in battle on this side of the valley in front of his camp, he would do so. But if he couldn't carry that out, with the routes investigated, he'd cross the valley and stream with less danger. At first light, the enemy's cavalry approaches towards camp and joins battle with our horsemen. Caesar orders the horsemen to yield deliberately and to retreat into the camp. And at the same time, he orders the camp to be blocked with a higher rampart in all directions and the gates to be fortified. And in managing these things, for everything to be rushed as much as possible and done with the pretense of fear. Block 51. Attracted by all these things, the enemy lead their forces over and arrange their line of troops in an unfavorable place with our men also brought down from the actual rampart. And they approach and hurl their missiles inside the fortification from all directions, and with heralds sent around, order that it is announced to be permitted that any Gaul or Roman may be willing to go across to them before the third hour without danger. After that time, they ordered that there wouldn't be permission, and they thought so light of our men that with the gates blocked with single rows of turf for the sake of appearances, because they didn't seem to be able to break in that way, some began to tear apart the rampart by hand, others to fill the ditches. Then Caesar, with a sally made from all the gates and with the cavalry sent out quickly, puts the enemy to flight, as if completely no one resisted with the purpose of fighting, and he killed a great number of them and stripped everyone of their arms. And block 52. Having feared to pursue them further because woods and marshes obstructed them, and also he didn't see that their post was abandoned with only slight harm, Caesar reached Cicero on the same day with all his forces safe. He's surprised at the enemy's towers built, shelters and fortifications. With the legion drawn out, he learns that every 10th soldier wasn't remaining without a wound. From all these things, he judges with how much danger and with how much courage matters have been managed. He praises Cicero highly for his service and the legion. One by one, he speaks to the centurions and the soldiers' tribunes, whose courage he'd got to know to have been outstanding from Cicero's testimony. He learns about Sabinus and Cotta's death more reliably from the prisoners. The next day, with a meeting held, he declares their achievement and he comforts and encourages the soldiers. He informs that this defeat, which has been received by his lieutenant's fault and rashness, is to be endured with a more patient mind, because by the immortal God's favour and their courage, with misfortune averted, neither lasting joy was left to the enemy, nor more protracted grief to them themselves.